Hi guys, this is supposed to be a review for Unit 1, but just in case, since we spent a very long time in Unit 1, I'm gonna try to put everything together so you can decide to skip over things that you already know. But if this is something that you are having a very hard time to remember, it would be a good idea that you go over every section and just take your time with it, as this is gonna be one of the main topics on the test. Again, it's not going to be a big portion, but still it would be presented on the exam. So, intro to ecosystems. And if we start looking at ecosystems and the relationships between organisms, we're going to find directly the relationships such as predation. We're going to find other types of relationships between species, but let's start with predation, which is a big one for Unit 1. So predation, the main example or the most common example that we know is about the hare and the lynx and how the patterns of population, this is going to represent the number of hares and the number of lynx, kind of follows after each one peaks again. This is going to depend on many factors such as disease, other predators, amount of food or resources available. But usually you're going to have the predator is going to follow the prey population. So if you're going to have a lot of prey, you're going to have a lot of, or an increase in the predator population that follows that prey population peak or boom. Other type of interspecific relationship, and interspecific means in between a species. So we have symbiosis. Again, it's going to be a close and long-term interaction, so it doesn't happen like predation. It's not going to be an interaction that happens over a very long period of time. It's a very short relationship. That's why it's not considered as part of these ones. But we also have that relationship cannot be long because one of the organisms die. So that's why it's not considered as an interspecific relationship, but it's still included because we still need to know what predation is. So symbiosis is a close and long-term relationship because the two species are still interacting. They are alive in a different way because not everybody's going to benefit. But anyway, it's a relationship in between two species in an ecosystem. There are three types of symbiosis: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So what we need to know about each is going to be who benefits, right? And then who's going to either get hurt or doesn't get affected. So in commensalism, we're going to have that the species doesn't get affected, the other one gets benefit. We're going to go through each one and mention some examples. And then parasitism, one gets affected, so it gets hurt. There are different kinds of parasites. And then mutualism, the two of them benefit. In competition, none of them benefit. They can both be damaged. And competition can be because of food, can be because of habitat, or mates. It could be interspecific or intraspecific as well. So let's start with mutualism. There are some examples here that you can take a look. But again, mutualism, both of them benefit. In commensalism, one of them does not get affected or benefit or anything. It's just kind of like a neutral. Like it's fine if you live on top of me or inside me or whatever, but it's not being affected. And then parasitism. There are different ways of classifying parasitism, but parasitism, just in general, one of the species will be affected and the other one will be benefited. Usually because the species is either living on a host, and you need to know the terminology host and parasite. So it can live on the host or inside the host. So by that, we mean we could have ectoparasites or endoparasites. And then, yeah, we do have some mesoparasites as well. But this is an example of a parasite over here. Okay, other essential concepts that we need to know, as I mentioned, competition can occur within a species or between a species, depending on the amount of resources that are limited or not. So we could have intraspecific between us, members of the same species, individuals. Remember that terminology is very important here. So individual species populations are different levels that I'm mentioning over here. And interspecific are going to be between members of different species. It could be two or more as well. Again, some of them will be competing because of some niche overlap that they have or some resource that they are presenting. This is a graph representing the two types of competition, the interspecific and the intraspecific. This one is going to show what kind of organism will be favored by the type of competition. For example, the interest-specific competition will favor the specialist population or organisms, species, and the intra-specific will favor more the generalist species. Then we also need to remember what resource partitioning is. So resource partitioning would be the use of resources in different ways at different times, so I don't have to compete necessarily. So I can use one resource and just kind of divide it so everybody's happy. If you want to take a look at that. This is just another chart to show you the two types of competition. So let's look at resource partitioning. So resource partitioning is if I have a determined area in which I can have various resources, I can have different organisms benefiting at the same time without bothering each other, without competition taking place. That means they each have a different niche in that area. Another way, doesn't necessarily mean an area. It could be an organism, right? A type of species that I have. So like an individual tree over here, depending on the side of the tree, or depending on the part of the tree that species selects, then that tree serves as a resource for resource partitioning. So that is another example of resource partitioning. Okay, number 2, terrestrial biomes. If you remember, you did the biome speed dating, so you should have all that information. So I'm just going to quickly mention the ones that you need to know. What is a biome, first of all? A biome is going to be an area that has different communities interacting of plants and animals, and usually with a specific climate because it is at a specific altitude and latitude. So starting from the colder to the kind of the hottest one, if we want to call it like that, we have the tundra. The location of the tundra and the main characteristics over here. I would say tundra, it's very easy to locate the tundra. Then we have the taiga. The taiga or the boreal forest as well is going to be right next to the tundra. Okay. Something we need to know is here coniferous, evergreen trees are a very important characteristic of the taiga. We do not have any trees over here. Of course, colder, a little bit less cold, but still very, very cold. Then we have the temperate rainforest. So temperate. Remember that name. Temperate means kind of like mild, in between, or medium. So the temperate rainforest would be the main name. I don't think they'll ask you for this name, but it's important that you know that. Temperate rainforest is going to be coastal, so it's going to be in the areas that are going to be like Canada, California a little bit, and a little bit of Chile and Argentina over here. So kind of like the edges. It has to have some kind of coastal area. Usually this area is going to have deciduous trees. Summer are going to be warmer and winter's colder, and there's going to be a lot of decomposition happening. Another characteristic of the tundra actually was covered by this over here. Is going to be the formation of the permafrost, and that permafrost is the impermeable frozen layer of soil. So the next one is the shrubland or the chaparral, the temperate woodland over here. This is the location of that temperate woodland, the chaparral. Then we have the temperate grassland, right? So the grassland is going to be in the middle. Very big areas. I'm in Argentina over here. That temperate grassland is going to be one of the reasons why Argentina has one of the best meat in the world, because they do have a very big area of grassland in which they can raise or do cattle ranching over here. So that's grassland. Tropical rainforest, the jungle, the one that we know the most, is gonna have a lot of productivity for sure, but it's gonna have the poorest soil, right? The poorest soil. We know the Amazon. We know some other tropical rainforest in other areas here. It would be important to know. The savanna or the tropical grassland as well. So it's going to be a little bit more tropical over here on the northern area of South America, and then some part of Bolivia over here. We have some parts of Africa as well with savannas. And we've seen that, right? Every time we see a giraffe, we kind of think of savannas. They do have some trees. Most of the trees are going to be isolated. Mostly it's going to be grasses. And then we have the desert. So the desert is going to be of the various types. We don't need to know all these types, but I just want you to know that there are various types of deserts. But the desert biome, of course, the one that is super, super hot and then super cold in the winter sometimes. Not all of them, but most of them are. And then adaptations from the plants to live in those environments, like lack of leaves and able to store water for a long time. Okay, global distribution. So we know that these biomes are distributed unevenly, thus we cannot count on the productivity, the species, the resources that those biomes can provide. So they are going to be dynamic as well. That means they are changing. So if I have tropical rainforest here, doesn't mean it's always been on this area, or it's going to be a tropical rainforest here forever, because we're having global climate changes. So that will switch the biome locations as well. Okay, now that was terrestrial biomes. Aquatic biomes, remember the flowing, non-flowing, or standing water, and the salt water and fresh water and all that. So let's take a look at that. The freshwater biomes is going to be formed by streams, river, ponds, and lakes. Usually the freshwater biomes will represent the source for drinking water. And then they are still characterized by salinity, depth, and water flow. You need to know the zones of a lake. So we're going to have the littoral zone closer to the shore. The littoral zone is very, very productive. You're going to have some plants there. Then we have the limnetic zone. So the limnetic zone is known as the open ocean kind of thing. And then the benthic zone. The benthic zone is going to be kind of like the muddy area of the lake. Photic zone is not important, but photic zone means it's just the area where the light reaches, or how far the light is going to reach. But for now, you need to know littoral zone, limnetic zone, photic zone, and benthic zone. So streams and rivers are going to be flowing water. They usually come from underground springs. There's going to be a lot of input from organic matter because of the runoff from falling leaves. And then turbulence is going to determine the dissolved oxygen. If you remember that was in one of our latest units. Therefore, it's going to determine what species can be supported. Now, the lakes and the ponds are standing water. Again, you have the four areas: littoral, limnetic, profundal, actually. So profundal is going to involve all of these area, and benthic. So littoral, limnetic, profundal, and benthic. So forget about the photic for now, but again, photic means where the light reaches. Okay, marine biomes, right? Marine, salty water, oceans, coral reefs, marshlands, estuaries. So I have to remember that here the algae is going to supply a large portion of the Earth's oxygen and take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We're going to talk about three things here. We're going to talk about oceans, we're going to talk about coral reefs, and then estuaries, and then marshlands. We'll talk about it on the next slide. So for the ocean, we also need to know the zones. So we're going to have the intertidal zone, right? The upper tide and the lower tide, or the high tide and the low tide, is going to make up the intertidal zone. Organisms need to be adapted for that kind of environment as well, for desiccation, they have to be able to attach to the area. Remember that. You can read more about this. We have the neritic zone, which involves the coastal kind of part of the continental shelf. Then we have the oceanic zone. Sorry, the airplanes are going crazy. I thought there were no flights. Anyway, so the oceanic zone is going to involve all the open ocean area. And then we have the pelagic zone. The pelagic zone is in the open ocean, and it involves the photic and the aphotic zone. The photic, again, where the light reaches, no light over here, and the benthic zone. And then we have one more zone at the very bottom, which is going to be the abyssal zone, right? The abyssal zone, where we have the ocean floor, the ocean ground, and then we have different formations at the very bottom. So we have, that was the ocean, so make sure you know the zones. The coral reefs, we know that they are the most diverse marine biome, so they're going to have a very high biodiversity. There are corals, which are tiny animals with external skeleton, which is made of calcium carbonate or limestone, right? They depend on usually its relationship with algae. So if I disturb algae in various ways, what's going to happen is it's going to affect the coral reef in that area. Thus, it's going to affect the productivity of that area. Coral bleaching happens because algae dies because of low pH and high sea temperatures, and therefore I would have a starving coral. Now, For estuaries, which is, where I have kind of like a meeting between marine and freshwater, I'm going to have important there because I have a very high productivity, and we're going to see that in productivity. So in productivity, the importance of estuaries is they are a feeding ground, they are a spawning ground, they are a nursery area, they are sediment stabilizers as well. Sediments always comes on exams, and they protect from storms. So I'm going to take estuaries as part of the wetlands that I'm going to describe on the next one when I mention marshlands. But let me describe wetlands in general, because questions on previous exams have involved wetlands in general terms instead of going into estuaries and marshlands, for example. Okay, so wetlands in general are hydric soils. We have three different types of wetlands: marshes, swamps, and bogs and fens. And then you can read about it if you don't remember what they have. What I do want to point out is that the economic benefits of having those wetlands. So these are the possible economic benefits. Again, remember on the test, if they ask you for economic benefits, it's going to be different than if I ask you for an ecological benefit, which I'm going to show you in a moment. This is the location showing from each of the wetlands as well. Now, what human activities degrade the wetlands? I would ask you to pause at this moment and take a look and read at the human activities that degrade wetlands. Those are usually the target points for these Unit 1 questions. And then one more thing that I added here is, how do I compare a wetland versus a treatment plant, a water treatment plant? So if you remember, water treatment plants, we covered on our very last unit, and we have the primary treatment and the secondary treatment. So for primary treatment, we're going to remove anything by physical means, right? So the wetlands will also have, if I want to compare a wetland to a primary water treatment plant, I have to compare something that removes things physically or mechanically, such as sediment, solid, particulates, something that's solid. And if it's a secondary treatment, I have to mention something like biological, bacterial, microbial removal of waste. So that is one comparison of wetlands in general. Now, sediment. Sediment is another hot topic that I really like on questions. So flow of sediments, human activities that are going to degrade the flow of sediments. Again, this question came on your last test, and I want to make sure that you don't forget all the options that you have. But the sediment flow is important because if I alter it by any chance, I'm going to alter different food chains, different food webs, the flow of a river or any other wetland in general. So these are the human activities that degrade the flow of sediment, and I explain it here. Now, the loss of sediment, how it harmed the wetlands from an ecological point of view, you can also see what are the options there. So I would really encourage you to take a look at these slides that I'm mentioning. Pretty much what I did is I copy answers from the questions from previous tests so you could see what kind of questions they have on this area. The same for this slide. So the consequences when a fertilizer flows into a wetland, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, like some of you had on your last exam, you're going to have some ecological consequences. These are economic consequences. And then what reduction strategies I can use for these. Okay, so if you take a look at this, again, pause the video and read and kind of make sense of, one more time, ecological consequences, economic consequences, and then reduction strategies. Okay, the global distribution of the non-mineral marine natural resources, such as, for example, fish, which we know that is a main type of food in various diets around the world, is going to have to depend first on the combination of salinity, depth, turbidity, nutrient availability, and temperature. We cover that also on like El Niño, La Niña, and how that affects the amount of fish that the fish catch. And then we also can see here what kind of countries or which countries have a higher consumption of fish per capita, but that doesn't mean that they fish more than other places. You can also see what is the fishing amount per area or per country or per continent. So take a look at this map. It's not the same. Okay, next one is the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle for these cycles, biogeochemical cycles, I have like 1 or 2 slides. So one more time, the carbon cycle, remember everything that's living is made out of carbon. So as soon as I have carbon somewhere, for example, of course, we know that in the air is carbon dioxide, but I also have carbon compounds like glucose in plants, and then it passes into primary consumers and so on. So all of that carbon, when it dies, decomposers will be able to convert it either into carbon in fossil fuels or sedimentation, like in the bottom of the ocean, at the bottom of the ocean, into calcium carbonate. That's part of calcium carbonate. It can also, by precipitation, go down into the ocean and become that dissolved carbon dioxide. It can produce weathering once it is, or it can produce carbon dioxide, can be produced by the weathering of calcium carbonate. And then when I burn the fossil fuels, I can also produce carbon dioxide. So that's one of the examples of diagrams for carbon cycle. Okay, so the nutrients in general are gonna circle through the ecosystem as matter. We know that matter cannot be created, destroyed, it's gonna be transformed. That's why it's gonna be circulated in the ecosystems. Now, the nutrient or biogeochemical cycles are gonna be the movement of those nutrients through the ecosystems, through the different types of spheres or areas. We also need to know at this point what is the difference between a reservoir, a sink, right, and a source. So the two types of reservoirs are sources and sinks. So what we need to know is what is a source and what is a sink. Both of them are reservoirs. We need to know what is a large flux and a small flux. So a source is going to be a pool that releases more nutrients than it accepts, and the sink is going to be a pool that accepts more nutrients than it releases, right? So the flux is going to happen because I'm going to have some rate at which materials are going to move in between the sinks and the sources. It can change over time, so the fluxes can change because of human activities. So the carbon cycle. Again, carbon, if you remember something from organic chemistry, carbon is found in carbohydrates, fats, proteins, in bones, cartilage, and shells. So the carbon cycle is going to describe how these carbon atoms are going to move in the environment. By that, we need to know what is the photosynthesis, what is the formula for photosynthesis, what's the equation for photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is going to be done by our primary producers, and how that transforms the carbon dioxide into organic carbon, and then how that passes into food chains and goes back into the atmosphere at some point. We also need to know the equation for respiration, in which carbon returns into the air and oceans as carbon dioxide, and that happens at every trophic level. Again, carbon sources and sinks are places that provide the carbon. They are both called reservoirs. Places in which carbon settles, or you could call it arrive if you want, are called sinks, and exchanges are called fluxes. There are 4 major reservoirs of carbon, which are the atmosphere, the ocean, the biosphere, and the fossil fuels. So sediments of storage of carbon. So the decomposition is going to help that carbon to go into the sediment. Like if we have carbon dioxide in the ocean, or we have some weathering, all of that is going to go into the sediment. And then from that sinking sediment, that can go back into either rock formation, or it could go back into fossil fuels. And then we burn fossil fuels back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. We also have carbon dioxide coming from decay, from decomposition, from respiration of every trophic level, from burning in general, biomass. And then we take in that carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, in terrestrial plants, and also in aquatic producers as well. But those are our 2 main kind of fluxes of taking carbon dioxide over here. This is another picture over here of the carbon cycle. These are the equations. In case you don't know the equations, you need to know them. You need to know the coefficients. You need to know the formulas. So burning fossil fuels are going to move carbon from the ground to the air. Cutting the forest, anything is going to change the amount of carbon. So the reason why we're putting or more carbon than whatever it was circulating before is because we're taking out carbon that hasn't been touched for so long. So of course we see that carbon increase in terms of amount. Okay. So over here, we can also see how that happens in the ocean. So atmospheric carbon, right, is gonna enter as dissolved carbon dioxide, will be taken by the phytoplankton, and then phytoplankton will do photosynthesis, will produce the organic matter eaten by the zooplankton, and then some of the zooplankton can be eaten by other animals and so on, or some of that could be combined with a calcium carbonate to form the shells of other organisms. When the organisms die, any of those in the trophic levels, that carbon will become sediment at the bottom of the ocean, and then we know what happens. So that's another in more detail. If you want to check this out, again, carbon dioxide, if it's combined in different ways, it can produce parts of shell, or it can sink at the bottom as sediment, it can enter into a food chain or whatever. Okay, nitrogen cycle. So this is the easy nitrogen cycle. We're going to have nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation can happen directly by the formation of, taking the nitrogen from the atmosphere, which, by the way, 70-something% in the atmosphere is the most abundant gas. So it can be taken in by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and that nitrogen-fixing bacteria can fix the nitrogen gas and transform it into ammonia. But also nitrogen fixation happens by lightning, in which that nitrogen becomes nitrates. So nitrogen fixation can transform nitrogen gas into either ammonia or any type of nitrate, just so you know. Okay, now it has entered, right? We cannot use nitrogen gas as it is. So if it's gonna enter into a cycle, it's gonna have to be fixed first by either lining, right? Lining, or by nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now, if it is by bacteria, it's gonna be transformed into ammonia. However, ammonia is not a compound that can be absorbed by plants directly, so it's gonna have to be transformed into other forms that plants can use. So ammonia will be transformed by nitrifying bacteria into nitrite, and then by nitrifying bacteria as well into nitrate. And the nitrate will be taken up by the plants. Now, why do plants need nitrate? Because nitrogen is going to be an essential component of proteins, and proteins are going to make every cell, every ribosome, every part of the cell of every living organism, including plants, are going to be made with proteins, and proteins contain nitrogen. Okay, now when that plant is eaten by the animal and so on, then it will pass down the nitrogen, right, in the form of the proteins. If the plants or the animals die, then their bodies, their biomass will have nitrogen, right? They could also excrete nitrogen, right? And also, again, die, which will make part of the dead organic matter. And by decomposition, the decomposers will transform those proteins, into ammonia again, and then it could follow that cycle. Now, the denitrifying bacteria can also take some of that nitrate and put it back into the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen gas. Okay. So one more time, nitrogen cycle, how much of the atmosphere? Pretty much what I just explained. Nitrogen fixation, it forms ammonium, but it can also form nitrates directly, okay? So this is a more familiar picture to you, which is the one that I used. But again, nitrogen fixation, if lighting happens, the nitrogen fixation is gonna transform the nitrogen gas into nitrates. But if it's nitrogen fixation, and then I lost my line of thought. Oh, here. By nitrifying bacteria, it's going to produce ammonia. Okay, by nitrogen fixing bacteria, By nitrogen fixing bacteria, it's going to produce ammonium. Okay, so then we also have once I have ammonium, I can transform it into nitrites, I can transform it into nitrates later. If plants and animals die, the decomposers will produce ammonium from their dead bodies, nitrogen, all those proteins from dead organisms. But I also have the application of fertilizers, because not all soils have nitrogen. So I'm going to need to add nitrates to plants through the use of fertilizers. And that started with the Haber process. So if you remember what the Haber process is, I'm gonna give you a short explanation of that on the next slide. Just want to make sure that you know what is the major reservoir. The major reservoir of nitrogen would be the atmosphere because of the amount of nitrogen present. Okay, so this is another picture of the nitrogen cycle. So if you could take a look and try to make sense of that one. Again, it's important that you practice with different diagrams for the nitrogen cycle. Now, what is the Haber process or the Haber-Bosch process? It's the production of fertilizers in which nitrogen is combined with hydrogen so they can make ammonia out of it, ammonia NH3. So humans can help the soil by providing with enough nitrates so the plants cannot have this limiting factor, right? We don't want nitrate to be the limiting factor for growing a specific crop. So they will produce fertilizers that will have enough nitrates for my plants to grow at any time. So fixing that atmospheric nitrogen with fertilizers will increase the emission, though. What is the bad thing about it? Will increase the emission of greenhouse gases and smog. It's going to wash other ions from the soil, like calcium and potassium. It's going to acidify the water and soil because of the presence of the nitrate ion. It's going to move nitrogen into terrestrial systems and oceans and so on. Now, this is a chart showing how humans put nitrogen into the environment. So we're going to put nitrogen again with the amount of fertilizer. That's going to be like the most nitrogen present. And then we're also going to have some nitrogen because of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria present in the roots of legumes. Remember that? So that also has an effect on it. We also have it from animal manure and from industrial sources as well. Okay. Phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle, the phosphorus is important because it's a component of cell membranes. If you remember, cell membranes are made of phospholipids, right? It's a phospholipid bilayer. That means it has phosphorus in it. We also have phosphorus in our DNA, RNA, ATP, and ADP. So the phosphorus cycle is going to account for how phosphorus moves. However, phosphorus is not really present and it doesn't move that fast as the other components that we've seen on the nitrogen or the carbon cycle. So we do have phosphates that are present in rocks and sediments, which is going to be our main sources of phosphorus. They are not released immediately unless it's by weathering, by erosion. There's no significant phosphorus in the atmosphere that you could say I'm inhaling phosphorus, for example. So it's in very low concentration, but we are affecting the phosphorus cycle because mining rocks for fertilizer are moving phosphorus from the soil into the water system. Remember that it's always a runoff that always kind of damages everything and it's going to take with it everything that comes from mines, for example. Phosphorus cycle is considered one of the main causes for eutrophication, or phosphorus, not phosphorus cycle, the phosphorus because of the runoff that it takes into rivers. So that would help, that would not help, that would damage the lake, a eutrophic lake. It would make it, it would make it, an oligotrophic lake. It would make a eutrophic lake. So it would make it very rich in nutrients, in this case, phosphorus or phosphates. So there has been some solutions because we don't want to have those dead zones as well. So you can read about that, and then the decrease in pollution and how we are encouraging to decrease the amount of fertilizer use and safe way of agricultural methods that we've talked about in the past. Okay, hydrologic cycle. This is the one you already know, but it's important, right? If we look at the amount of water available, most of it is salty. Just the fresh water from that 2.5, if we want to expand, most of it is frozen. And then the rest of it is groundwater, and most of it is going to be permafrost. So we really don't have a lot of surface atmospheric water. Now, this picture over here, I'm going to come back to it, is going to represent transpiration, and transpiration is one of the processes present in the hydrologic cycle. So let me just go ahead and start explaining it actually. It starts here on the ground. If you zoom in over here, we have this zoom in and this is a root hair cell. So that root hair cell is gonna let water in by the process of osmosis, right? Osmosis, you need to know what osmosis is. It's gonna go from high to low water potential. So it doesn't require energy. Make sure you remember that it's a type of passive transport. And then it's gonna enter into the xylem, and that xylem, by capillary action, will take it up into the leaf. Now, in the leaf, is going to be part of the photosynthesis process, but then some of that water is going to be excreted, right? It's going to be excreted as water vapor through the stoma or the stomata. So remember that that is a very important part on the transpiration, or sorry, on the hydrologic cycle, transpiration. Now, the primary source or reservoir, the primary reservoir for water is going to be the ocean. And then we have the small reservoirs are going to be groundwater and ice caps. But the primary main big resource is going to be the ocean. Okay, hydrologic cycle again, what it is and why is it important. Processes important are transpiration, which I already explained, evaporation, precipitation, and runoff. So runoff, I know that you know the water cycle. I just want to mention runoff. So runoff, again, the problem with the water cycle and runoff is that we are affecting that, since the runoff involves more than just water being carried into a lake or a river or an aquatic biome. It's going to bring with it some kind of pollutant, some kind of fertilizer, some kind of biomass that we don't need on that lake, making that lake eutrophic. Also, it's important because of the percolation process. So percolation is going to allow that rainwater to pass into the groundwater, but it will take with it other components, such as some of the contaminants from landfills. You mentioned that on your exam. So that is a problem. So percolation and runoff would be my two main points on this one. So how humans are impacting the hydrologic cycle. I just gave you two examples. Make sure you read the rest. Primary productivity. Primary productivity, these are all your definitions that you need to know. What is gross, what is net, what is primary, secondary, gross primary, and net primary. The units for primary productivity are going to be kilocalories per meter square per year in terms of calculation. There is only one equation. We have gross equals gross plus respiration equals net, or net equals gross minus respiration. Okay, so primary productivity is going to be the rate at which solar energy or sunlight is converted into photosynthesis over a unit of time. So primary productivity can also be defined as a rate of biomass formation, because of course if I'm talking about photosynthesis, I'm talking about formation of biomass, right? I'm talking about those organic molecules forming. So that primary productivity, who does that? Well, phytoplankton. We're gonna see that is gonna be measured. If I measure the amount of oxygen produced, I will know what is the primary productivity. There are actually devices that scientists use to measure primary productivity, but for the purposes of the exam, you can measure it by directly measuring the amount of oxygen production. Again, photosynthesis equation, respiration is a reverse reaction. So you can measure the rate of photosynthesis by measuring the amount of CO2 as well, like the amount of carbon-14, a radioactive carbon if you want to. You can also measure the amount of oxygen being produced, and it will tell you the amount of primary productivity. You can also measure the rate of formation of plant matter by measuring the biomass. Again, one more time, net is going to be gross minus whatever respiration, right, metabolic cost that trophic level has. So there is a problem with productivity. Remember that for photosynthesis to occur, for this equation to happen, I'm going to need sunlight. And the problem with sunlight is that not all sunlight can be absorbed or be used for photosynthesis. For example, most red light is going to only be absorbed in the upper 1 meter of water in the ocean. Now, the blue light will only penetrate deeper than 100 meters in the clearest water. So that is going to affect the rate of photosynthesis that I have. Thus, is going to affect the productivity that I have. Now, if I just told you that the biggest reservoir of water is going to be the ocean. And then I tell you that primary productivity is determined by this. If I ask you which biome has the greatest productivity and you tell me the ocean, that answer will be wrong. And the reason for that is because, again, this, right? The fact that first, we don't use all of that light, and second, the ocean, if we measure it per unit, it's here, per unit area, per unit time, is not really going to give us the greatest productivity. So if we look at the biomes that we talked in the past, we could have that estuaries would have a very high productivity, or marshes, same as tropical rainforests, but open ocean cannot. Open ocean is going to have way less productivity just because of the area deal on the formula. So the net primary productivity will be represented by these three main type of biomes, again, terrestrial and aquatic, but not the open ocean. Other factors affecting the rate of photosynthesis are going to be how much carbon dioxide I have present. So there is always kind of like a limit because there are other factors, not only sunlight. If I have enough sunlight but I don't have enough carbon dioxide, it's like not having substrate for an enzyme to actually go into photosynthesis. Other factors are going to be temperature, light, and enzymes that work on the actual photosynthesis pathway. So again, those factors will be affecting photosynthesis. Net primary productivity in terms of location around the globe, we can see that. And if you look at the little ruler at the bottom, you can see what happens to, or how net primary productivity changes across the different biomes and locations in the world. Now, what is gross primary production? Gross primary production is going to be the amount of chemical energy, okay, expressed in carbon biomass that primary producers give, or I don't want to use the word create, but they produce, right? So primary producers will produce a certain amount of productivity, and then that will be my gross primary productivity. Primary because it's produced by my producers. And then minus the respiration, I will have my net primary productivity. Okay, trophic levels. So trophic levels, linking, this is an easy topic for you. We're gonna have to look at how energy moves. Remember that trophic levels determine or show or represent the amount of energy moving in a food chain, right? So there is a movement of energy because organisms need to maintain their structure and function. So they do that through the biogeochemical cycles that we just mentioned, but also through the absorbance or usage of energy. So we need to explain this through the two laws of thermodynamics. So the first one is going to be the conservation of matter. Again, matter cannot be created or destroyed. It's going to be rearranged. This is an example of it. But we can also see that in this case, if we're talking about matter, right, we have transformed carbon dioxide, matter, into glucose, C6H12O6. Now, once that glucose has been produced, that matter is going to pass into the next trophic level. So remember, this is the first trophic level, second trophic level, right? So on the second trophic level, we're going to have that the primary consumers will be absorbing or eating this biomass, this mass, and they will lose some into the environment. But by losing doesn't mean disappearing. It's being transformed again into carbon dioxide, right? But it's also going to be released as heat, some of that energy, and the rest of the mass will be passed into the next level. So we have to keep into account when matter goes into trophic levels and when energy goes into trophic levels, both of them, okay? So now energy moves only in one direction. However, matter will be cycling through. This is a terrestrial food chain. This is an aquatic food chain. You can also see that over here. The energy is represented with red arrows and the matter is represented with blue arrows. So the matter can cycle back, but the energy cannot. Okay, so the energy flow and the 10% rule. So we have that the producers will produce a certain amount of biomass and a certain amount of energy. And if we just focus on energy, the 10% rule is going to tell me how much energy approximately, again, is not something that is strictly defined, but it would tell me that that is the approximate amount of energy that's transferred from one trophic level to the next. So, for example, if I have 10,000 kilocalories produced in the primary trophic level or in the producers, we're going to have that only 10% will be able to pass into the secondary trophic level, which are the primary consumers, which in this case will be 1,000 kilocalories, because most of it will be lost by respiration, right? The heat loss represents respiration, and then the rest will be passed into the next, and so on. That's why we cannot have a very long food chain. So this is another example over here. Again, in each one, what you see heat, that means it has lost through the process of respiration. So the loss of energy that occurs when energy moves from lower to higher trophic levels can be explained through the laws of thermodynamics. So let me pause here and remind you of what are the two laws. The first one is talking about matter, conservation of matter, right? So energy cannot be created, destroyed. So the quantity of energy always stays the same. The second law tells me the quality of energy reduces with every change. So it increases entropy, right? So disorder is always created. So that's the second one, is talking about the quality of that. Okay, and the last point of unit 1 is going to be food chains and food webs, a very simple topic. So we're going to have a food web is when I connect different food chains, but usually they will have one producer, and I don't see an animal repeated in here. I can only represent that animal once. Remember that. Remember that removing one of those animals will have various effects. So if I remove this one, what happens to the population of red-breasted nuthatch, or what happens to the population of coyotes, and so on. We also need to know at this point for food webs, what is a positive feedback loop like, and a negative feedback loop. So these are examples over here, how the removal of something can increase, right? The effect of something else, or how the removal of something, how the lessening of something can increase the amount of something else. Like in this case, I'm assuming this is how you feel right now. Okay, so last but not least, type of definition, keystone species. So keystone species are going to be a species that if you removed, all the food web will be greatly affected, right? In this case, for example, top predators tend to be keystone species. You created a presentation on these, but keystone species, remember definition, okay? Invasive species, sorry, it was not the last definition. So invasive species are non-native organisms that will cause ecological harm. So there is an example here on the different trophic levels. They will have an effect like lionfish. This is called a lionfish. And what happens if you remove it? What would happen to the other trophic levels? Also, an invasive species can be brought, like a fox, for example. If a fox has a more or a wider niche, right, it's going to have a wider diet, the quoll is going to be affected because the fundamental niche, since it's similar, there's going to be some competition, interspecific competition, right? So because of that competition, then the quoll's realized niche, remember the realized niche is what it actually does, is going to be shrinking. Thus, the population will be dropping, okay? And that's it.